The girl scrubbing gum off the train station floor at 2 in the morning was about to design the fastest train America had ever seen. The last train of the night screamed through the station in a rush of steel and cold wind, rattling the loose ceiling panels above Platform 9. Rain hammered against the giant glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago, turning the city lights into blurry streaks of gold and white. Clara Bennett knelt on the stained tile floor with one hand wrapped around a mop handle and the other clutching a stack of folded blueprints against her chest so they wouldn't touch the dirty water. Her gray janitor uniform hung loosely on her thin frame. The sleeves rolled past grease-smudged wrists, and the soles of her sneakers were splitting near the toes from too many double shifts. A businessman hurried past her without looking down. Another man bumped her shoulder hard enough to nearly knock the papers from her hands. "Watch it," he muttered, annoyed, as if she were part of the floor itself. Clara lowered her eyes and whispered a quiet apology, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. That was the thing about people in places like this. They only looked at uniforms. They never looked at faces. Above her, a giant television mounted near the ticket counters flashed breaking news about Carter Rail Industries. America's first 200-mile-per-hour train project enters final testing phase, the reporter announced excitedly. On screen, engineers in expensive suits stood beside a sleek silver train under bright camera lights while investors applauded. Clara paused for half a second, staring at the screen longer than she should have. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her hidden drawings. Then footsteps echoed across the empty platform behind her. 3 young engineers wearing Carter Rail badges walked toward the maintenance corridor, laughing loudly, coffee cups in hand. One of them noticed the rolled papers sticking out from Clara's bag. "What's that?" he asked with a smirk. Clara quickly slid the papers deeper into her backpack. "Nothing. Come on." Another guy laughed. "What is it?" "Secret janitor stuff." The tallest engineer suddenly grabbed one of the blueprints before she could stop him. He unfolded it carelessly. The laughter around him slowly faded. His eyebrows lifted for a second at the complicated sketches covering the page. Aerodynamic calculations. Magnetic stability notes. Will pressure distribution formulas. Then his mouth curled into a cruel grin. "Wait," he chuckled loudly. "You actually think you can design trains?" The others burst out laughing. Clara stood up quickly, embarrassed heat rushing into her cheeks. "Give it back." "This is adorable," another engineer mocked. "A cleaning lady building high-speed rail." The tall engineer shook his head dramatically. "Honey, people from trailer parks don't become engineers." He tossed the blueprint back toward her, but the paper slipped from his fingers too hard, landing directly in a puddle near the platform edge. Dirty rainwater soaked through the corner instantly. Clara froze. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Her father's old silver pocket watch rested heavily inside her jacket pocket as she stared at the smeared ink bleeding across the paper. The engineers laughed one last time before disappearing down the hall. "Maybe stick to mops," one of them called back. Silence returned to the station except for the distant thunder outside. Slowly, Clara walked toward the ruined blueprint and knelt beside the puddle. Her trembling fingers carefully lifted the soaked paper from the floor as if it were something alive. Most people would have seen a ruined drawing. Clara saw 6 years of midnight calculations, hundreds of sleepless nights, every dream her father never got the chance to finish. A shadow suddenly stretched across the wet platform beside her. "That design," a calm male voice said quietly behind her. "Where did you learn to calculate vibration drift like that?" Clara looked up sharply. Standing a few feet away was a tall man in a dark maintenance jacket with rain still dripping from his shoulders. His hands rested casually in his pockets, but his sharp blue eyes were locked directly onto the blueprint in her hands. And for the first time all night, someone was finally looking at her instead of the uniform. Clara immediately shoved the wet blueprint back into her backpack and stood up so fast the mop bucket rattled beside her. "It is nothing," she said quietly, avoiding the stranger's eyes. The man studied her for another second beneath the flickering station lights. Up close, he looked older than the engineers who had mocked her, maybe mid-30s, broad shoulders hidden beneath the dark maintenance jacket, rainwater still dripping from his hair onto the concrete floor. There was something calm about him, something sharp beneath the silence. "Nothing usually does not include resonance equations," he replied. Clara's fingers tightened around the backpack strap. Most people saw random lines on paper. This man had recognized the math instantly. That alone made her nervous. "You should not leave electrical carts blocking emergency exits," she said quickly, changing the subject while pointing toward a maintenance vehicle behind him. Someone could trip. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You noticed that too?" Before Clara could answer, her supervisor's angry voice echoed across the platform. "Bennett." Clara flinched immediately. A heavy-set man in a wrinkled station jacket marched toward her holding a clipboard against his chest. "Why is this floor still wet? You think passengers care about your little daydreams?" Clara lowered her head again. "Sorry, Mr. Wilkins. I will finish now." Mr. Wilkins glanced toward the stranger. "Sorry about the mess, sir. Some people here forget what they were hired to do." The stranger said nothing. He simply watched Clara kneel back down beside the puddle and continue scrubbing the floor with freezing red hands. After a moment, he finally spoke. "What is your name?" Clara hesitated. "Clara Bennett." His eyes lingered on her face for half a second. "I am Ryan," he said simply. "Not Ethan Carter. Not CEO of Carter Rail Industries. Just Ryan." Then he walked away into the rain without another word. Clara watched him disappear through the station doors before exhaling softly. Something about that conversation unsettled her in a way she could not explain. Most people ignored her completely. This man had looked directly at her like she mattered. Like her ideas mattered. That feeling stayed with her long after her shift ended at 3:30 in the morning. Outside, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle coating the empty streets silver beneath the streetlights. Clara pulled her hood tighter and walked 6 blocks to the tiny apartment she rented above an old pawn shop. The radiator barely worked. Water stains spread across the ceiling. A single lamp illuminated stacks of engineering books piled beside the couch. Aerodynamics, structural mechanics, railway systems. Most were second-hand library sales with torn covers and highlighted pages from strangers she would never meet. Clara carefully removed the soaked blueprint from her backpack and laid it flat across the kitchen table beside a rusted metal fan. Part of the ink had smeared near the wheel alignment calculations. She stared at the damaged corner silently before reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out the silver pocket watch her father once carried every day. The glass was cracked. The hands no longer moved. But she still wound it every night out of habit. Her thumb brushed across the engraving on the back. Thomas Bennett, 28 years with Midwestern Rail. Clara closed her eyes as memories flooded back like old train tracks rushing beneath steel wheels. She was 11 years old again, sitting cross-legged inside a noisy garage while her father spread blueprints across the workbench covered in grease stains and coffee rings. "People think trains are only machines," he had told her once while tightening a bolt with oil-covered hands. "But the right train can change a family's life. It gets people home faster, gets fathers back to dinner, gets daughters opportunities they never had before." Clara swallowed hard and opened her eyes again. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the fan drying her ruined blueprint. On the wall above the kitchen table hung a faded newspaper clipping she could never bring herself to throw away. "Local rail engineer killed after safety dispute." Clara stared at it for a long moment before whispering softly into the empty apartment. "I am still trying, Dad." Then she reached for a pencil and began drawing again. The next evening, Chicago Union Station pulsed with noise again as commuters rushed beneath giant hanging clocks and glowing departure boards. Clara moved quietly through the crowd, pushing her cleaning cart past exhausted travelers clutching coffee cups and rolling suitcases. Her body felt heavy after sleeping barely 3 hours, but her mind would not stop replaying the conversation from the night before. Resonance equations. The stranger had recognized them instantly. Nobody outside advanced rail engineering circles should have noticed something like that, especially not a maintenance worker. She tried to forget about it and focus on work. At exactly 9:15, a sharp electronic alarm suddenly echoed across the station. Red warning lights flashed near track 12. Passengers froze in confusion as a mechanical gate halfway down the platform jerked violently before locking in place. "Great," Mr. Wilkins groaned from across the station. "Not again." 2 station technicians hurried toward the control panel carrying toolkits while frustrated passengers began complaining loudly. Clara slowed her cart instinctively, watching the flickering warning display mounted beside the gate. "System overload. Brake synchronization failure. One technician crouched beside the panel and started typing commands into a portable monitor. "The backup relay is dead," he muttered. "We are going to have to shut the whole track down." "You cannot shut track 12 down," another employee argued nervously. "The Carter rail prototype arrives in 40 minutes. Clara's eyes lifted immediately. Prototype. Her pulse quickened. Then she saw him. The same man from the night before stood several feet behind the technicians wearing another dark maintenance jacket and black gloves. Rain no longer covered his shoulders tonight, but his calm blue eyes scanned the malfunctioning gate carefully. Ryan, or whoever he really was. He noticed Clara standing near her cart and gave a small nod of recognition. Before she could react, one of the technicians cursed under his breath as sparks briefly flashed inside the control panel. "The entire sequence is corrupted," he snapped. "Who installed this? Garbage." Clara stared at the warning codes on the screen for 3 silent seconds. Then 4. Something felt wrong. Not broken. Wrong. Her father used to say machines talked if people listened carefully enough. Most engineers listened for noise. Great engineers listened for patterns. Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. "It is not the relay," she said quietly. Both technicians looked up immediately, annoyed. "Excuse me." Clara pointed toward the flickering monitor. "The brake timing sequence is delayed by 0.3 seconds because the secondary sensor is feeding duplicate pressure data into the system." Silence. One technician blinked at her. The other laughed openly. And the janitor figured that out from across the platform. Clara ignored the mockery and stepped closer to the screen. "Look at the vibration readings," she continued softly. "Every 6th cycle spikes higher than the others. That means the left track sensor is overcompensating." The older technician frowned slightly now. Slowly, he pulled up another diagnostic window. His expression changed almost immediately. "Wait," he muttered. "She is right." The younger technician straightened. "No way." Clara reached carefully past them and tapped one section of the monitor. "Reset this calibration loop manually," she said. "Not automatically. The software keeps repeating the corrupted sequence." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the older technician followed her instructions exactly. The gate lights flickered once, twice. Then suddenly the entire system stabilized with a sharp mechanical click. The locked barrier smoothly lifted back into position as the warning alarms stopped completely. Around the station, passengers immediately resumed walking as if nothing had happened. But near the control panel, nobody spoke. The younger technician stared openly at Clara now. "How did you?" Clara immediately stepped backward, uncomfortable with the attention. "My father worked on rail systems," she said quietly. "I learned a few things." She grabbed her cleaning cart quickly, ready to disappear before more questions came. But Ryan stepped directly into her path. Not aggressively, calmly. His eyes held the same sharp curiosity from the night before, only stronger now. "A few things," he repeated softly. Clara swallowed. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her not with pity or amusement, but with genuine interest. Then Ryan glanced toward the arriving silver prototype train sliding silently into the station under glowing white lights. "Tell me something, Clara Bennett," he said quietly. "Why is someone who understands rail systems better than my senior engineers cleaning floors at midnight?" Clara stared at him for a moment, caught completely off guard by the question. Around them, passengers boarded trains beneath glowing platform signs while cold winds swept through the station tunnels. But suddenly the noise felt distant. "Because life does not care what you are good at," she answered quietly. Ryan studied her face carefully, almost like he was trying to solve something. "And cleaning floors pays the bills." Clara gave a small, humorless smile. "Most of them." Before he could say anything else, Mr. Wilkins shouted her name again from the far end of the platform. Clara immediately grabbed her cart. "I should get back to work." "Wait." She stopped. Ryan reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a plain white keycard. No company logo, no name, just a black magnetic strip and the number 47 printed in silver. Clara frowned slightly. "What is this?" "Workshop access," he replied calmly. "Lower maintenance level. After midnight." Clara blinked in confusion. "Why would I need that?" "Because someone with your talent should not be sketching train designs beside a leaking radiator." Her breath caught slightly. Ryan continued before she could answer. "The station closes at midnight. Nobody uses the engineering workshop until morning." Clara looked down at the keycard resting in her hand. "You are serious?" Very. Why? For the first time, he hesitated slightly. Then he glanced toward the silver prototype train waiting silently under the station lights. Because everybody else keeps looking at your uniform, he said quietly. I am looking at your equations. Then he walked away again before Clara could respond. That night, long after the final, passengers disappeared and the giant station lights dimmed one section at a time. Clara stood alone outside the heavy steel door marked Maintenance Level B. The white keycard felt strangely heavy in her trembling hand. She kept expecting security guards to stop her, or someone to tell her this had all been some kind of joke. Slowly, she swiped the card. The lock clicked green. Clara stepped inside carefully. The workshop beneath the station was larger than she imagined. Fluorescent lights reflected off metal work tables covered with engine parts, calibration tools, welding masks, and computer monitors displaying rail diagnostics. Half-disassembled train components rested on massive steel platforms, while electrical cables snaked across the concrete floor. To Clara, it felt less like a workshop and more like a cathedral. She walked slowly through the room, almost afraid to touch anything. Then her eyes landed on the massive digital drafting screen mounted near the back wall. Her pulse quickened instantly. She had only seen equipment like this online. People like her did not get access to technology like this. Not in real life. She carefully set her backpack down and unrolled her worn blueprints across the table. For a long moment, she simply stared at them beneath the bright workshop lights. Every crease, every coffee stain, every late-night correction made in her freezing apartment suddenly looked different here, like they belonged. Clara reached for a digital pen with cautious fingers and began adjusting one of her aerodynamic calculations. Minutes turned into hours without her noticing. She refined wheel pressure ratios, reworked airflow channels, modified suspension geometry. Outside, Chicago slept beneath cold rain and distant traffic. But underground, Clara Bennett finally felt awake. Around 2:30 in the morning, the sound of footsteps echoed softly across the workshop floor. Clara looked up sharply. Ryan stood near the doorway holding 2 steaming paper cups of coffee. You are still here, he said. Clara glanced toward the clock in surprise. I lost track of time. He handed her one of the cups. Most people would. She accepted it carefully. Thank you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The workshop hummed quietly around them while blueprints covered nearly every inch of the table between them. Ryan's eyes drifted across her calculations. You redesigned the magnetic stabilization system, he said softly. Clara nodded. The current model wastes energy correcting lateral vibration instead of preventing it. His expression sharpened slightly. That is exactly what our senior engineering team said last month. Clara looked up. Silence. Ryan took a slow sip of coffee without answering directly. Then his gaze returned to her designs. You know, he said quietly, if this system actually works, it could change high-speed rail in America. Clara looked down at the glowing blueprint screen, her father's old pocket watch resting beside her hand. That was always the dream. For the next 3 weeks, Clara lived 2 completely different lives. During the day, she scrubbed station floors beneath fluorescent lights while commuters rushed past without seeing her. At night, hidden beneath Chicago Union Station, she transformed into the engineer she had dreamed of becoming since childhood. Every evening after her shift ended, she used the white keycard to enter Workshop 47. The room slowly began changing around her. New blueprints covered the walls. Empty coffee cups gathered beside computer monitors. Equations filled dry erase boards from corner to corner. Clara barely noticed time anymore. She only noticed progress. And almost every night, Ryan appeared somewhere between midnight and sunrise. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he silently reviewed her calculations for nearly an hour without interrupting her concentration. Other nights they argued over airflow resistance ratios and suspension tolerances until 3 in the morning while cold rain rattled against the underground ventilation ducts above them. You are compensating too late, Clara said one night while pointing toward a digital model spinning on the screen. The stabilization system should predict vibration before impact. Ryan crossed his arms beside her. Prediction models fail under weather pressure. Clara shook her head immediately. Only because your engineers built them for ideal conditions instead of real environments. He raised an eyebrow slightly. My engineers again. Clara froze for half a second. Ryan noticed, but instead of answering, he simply smiled faintly and stepped closer to the monitor. Show me how you would fix it. Nobody had ever spoken to Clara like that before. Not teachers. Not station employees. Not the engineers who mocked her. Ryan challenged her ideas without dismissing them. He listened. That frightened her almost as much as it excited her. One night, around 1:30 in the morning, Clara accidentally fell asleep at the drafting table with a pencil still in her hand. The workshop lights glowed softly over scattered blueprints while snow drifted outside the station fence above ground. She woke slowly to warmth settling over her shoulders. Ryan had draped his dark coat carefully around her without waking her. He stood near the far workbench reviewing one of her suspension diagrams beneath the pale overhead lights. Clara watched him quietly for a moment before speaking. You really understand this stuff? Ryan glanced up. Enough to know you should have been hired by every engineering firm in Chicago already. Clara gave a tired laugh. Most firms stop reading applications when they see, I never finished college. His expression darkened slightly. That is their mistake. The words landed deeper than he probably intended. Clara looked away quickly, pretending to reorganize papers so he would not notice how much that simple sentence affected her. Then Ryan picked up one of the older blueprints from the table. His eyes narrowed slightly at the faded handwriting along the corner. Thomas Bennett. Your father designed these sections? Clara nodded slowly. Some of them. He was talented. Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Clara spoke softly without looking up. They blamed him for an accident 12 years ago. Ryan's expression changed immediately. Clara continued quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the hum of the workshop. He tried warning the company about a brake failure issue before the crash happened. Nobody listened. Ryan stared at her carefully. Now, what company? Clara finally looked up at him. Midwestern Rail Systems. Something unreadable flickered briefly across Ryan's face before disappearing again. Clara noticed it immediately. What? She asked quietly. Nothing. But it clearly was not nothing. Before Clara could press further, the workshop speakers suddenly crackled overhead. Attention engineering staff, a voice announced. Emergency executive meeting moved to 7:30 tomorrow morning regarding velocity project instability concerns. Ryan's eyes shifted instantly toward the speaker. Clara noticed the reaction. Velocity project? She repeated softly. Ryan hesitated. For the first time since meeting him, he looked genuinely cornered. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black access badge. Clara's breath caught the moment she saw the silver lettering beneath the station lights. Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Rail Industries. The room suddenly felt very still. Clara stared at the black badge in Ethan's hand, as if her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Chief Executive Officer, Carter Rail Industries. The words echoed inside her chest louder than the rumble of trains above them. Suddenly, every strange detail from the past few weeks snapped together at once. The engineers stepping aside when he entered certain hallways. The way technicians instantly followed his suggestions without question. His deep understanding of every system inside the workshop. Clara slowly stepped backward from the drafting table. You lied to me, she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. I did not tell you everything. You let me think you were a maintenance worker. Because if I had introduced myself as Ethan Carter, you never would have spoken to me honestly. Clara looked away sharply, hurt flickering across her face before she could hide it. That does not make it better. Silence filled the workshop for a moment. Ethan carefully set the badge down beside her blueprints. I never mocked you, he said quietly. I never looked down on you. Clara folded her arms tightly across herself. No, you just tested me. Ethan did not deny it. That hurt. More than she expected. For weeks, Workshop 47 had felt like the only place in the world where she was seen for who she really was. Now, even that felt uncertain. Why are you really here? She asked softly. Ethan exhaled slowly before answering. Because the velocity project is failing. Clara looked up immediately despite herself. Failing how? Ethan stepped toward the massive digital monitor mounted near the workbench and activated a series of engineering simulations. Sleek silver train models appeared on the screen alongside endless rows of diagnostic data. At speeds above 180 miles per hour, the train becomes unstable during lateral wind shifts, he explained. Our engineers have spent 11 months trying to fix it. Clara moved closer to the monitor instinctively. Even angry, she could not ignore engineering problems. Ethan continued quietly. The government demonstration is in 6 days. If the train fails publicly, we lose the entire national contract. Clara studied the simulation carefully. The instability pattern looked strangely familiar. Then her eyes narrowed. Wait. She leaned closer toward the screen. Pause that frame. Ethan obeyed immediately. Clara pointed toward the vibration graph flashing along the lower corner. This is not aerodynamic failure. Ethan looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Clara's fingers moved rapidly across the controls now, pulling up additional stabilization readings. Your correction systems are overcompensating during crosswind pressure changes. Her voice grew more focused with every second. The train is fighting itself. Ethan stared at her silently as she continued analyzing the data faster than most of his senior engineers could. Who designed this calibration structure? Clara asked suddenly. Ethan hesitated slightly. Vice President Daniel Mercer supervised the final integration. Clara's expression tightened immediately. Then he changed the original calculations. Ethan frowned. How do you know that? Clara turned toward him slowly. Because these are my equations. Silence crashed across the workshop. Ethan blinked once. What? Clara reached into her backpack with trembling hands and pulled out one of her older blueprints. She spread it across the drafting table beside the digital monitor. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Side by side, the designs matched almost perfectly. Same airflow distribution, same stabilization framework, same suspension geometry, except one critical difference. Clara pointed toward the modified calibration line on Ethan's screen. This adjustment should never have been changed, she said quietly. It creates delayed magnetic correction under pressure. Ethan stared between the blueprint and the monitor, realization slowly darkening his expression. Mercer presented these designs to the board 3 weeks ago, he said carefully. Clara gave a faint bitter laugh. Then your vice president stole them. Ethan looked at her sharply. Why did you never tell anyone about your work? Clara's eyes drifted toward her father's cracked silver pocket watch resting beside the keyboard. Because nobody listens to girls cleaning train stations. The words landed harder than anything else she had said. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. I am listening now. Then suddenly the emergency alert system inside the workshop blared violently overhead. Red warning. Velocity test failure. Immediate response required. Ethan's phone rang at the same moment. He answered instantly. His face drained of color within seconds. What happened? He demanded sharply. A terrified voice exploded through the speaker. The prototype destabilized during overnight testing, the engineer shouted. Sir, we almost lost the entire train. Ethan and Clara arrived at the Carter rail testing facility less than 30 minutes later. The massive building on the edge of Chicago glowed against the dark winter sky, while emergency lights flashed red across the snow-covered tracks outside. Engineers rushed through glass hallways carrying tablets and diagnostic reports as security teams moved equipment across the testing floor. Clara stepped out of Ethan's black SUV slowly, overwhelmed by the size of everything around her. She had spent years sketching trains alone in a tiny apartment above a pawn shop. Now, she stood inside the most advanced rail facility in America. But nobody noticed her. Every employee who passed looked directly at Ethan with nervous expressions. Mr. Carter. Sir, the board is already in the control room. The Department of Transportation is demanding answers. Ethan barely slowed his pace. Clara hurried beside him through giant sliding doors into the main engineering center where enormous digital screens covered the walls from floor to ceiling. At the center of the room sat the Velocity prototype itself behind reinforced glass. Sleek, silver, beautiful. Even standing still, the train looked impossibly fast. But the atmosphere inside the control room felt nothing like triumph. Engineers argued over one another while simulation data flashed violently across the monitors. The stabilization system collapsed again at 182 miles per hour. No structural damage, but the oscillation exceeded safe margins. If this happens during the public demonstration, the entire project is dead. The moment Ethan entered, silence spread across the room. Then a tall man with perfectly styled gray hair stepped forward from near the central monitor. Daniel Mercer, Vice President of Carter Rail Industries. His expensive suit looked flawless despite the chaos around him. But his eyes immediately narrowed when he saw Clara standing beside Ethan. What is she doing here? Mercer asked coldly. Clara instantly recognized the same arrogance she had seen in the engineers who mocked her at the station. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. She is here because she understands the stabilization problem better than anyone in this room. Several engineers exchanged confused glances. Mercer laughed softly like the idea itself was ridiculous. Ethan, with all due respect, she is a janitor. Clara lowered her eyes automatically, years of humiliation returning in one painful wave. But Ethan's voice cut through the room immediately. And somehow she still identified flaws your entire division missed for 11 months. Silence. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. The system failed because the weather variables changed unexpectedly. No, Clara said quietly. Before she could stop herself, every head turned toward her. Her pulse hammered violently now, but she forced herself to continue. The system failed because someone altered the predictive correction timing. Mercer crossed his arms. And you know this because? Clara stepped toward the central monitor slowly. Because those calculations were originally mine. The room exploded into murmurs instantly. Mercer's face darkened. That is absurd. Clara ignored him and pulled up the stabilization framework on the giant screen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she highlighted one specific sequence. This adjustment here delays magnetic correction by 0.4 seconds during crosswind pressure. She looked directly at Mercer now. I never designed it that way. Ethan watched her silently from across the room while the engineers studied the screen more carefully. One older engineer suddenly frowned. Wait, he muttered softly. She is right. Another engineer stepped closer. The correction timing is reversed. Mercer immediately interrupted. Enough. His sharp voice echoed across the control room. We are not rewriting a billion-dollar system based on theories from someone who never even finished engineering school. The room fell silent again. Clara felt the old shame rising in her chest exactly the way it always had before. Trailer park girl. Cleaning lady. Nobody important. Mercer stepped closer toward Ethan now. The public demonstration is in 48 hours, he said firmly. We cannot risk this project on amateur guesses. Ethan looked toward Clara. She stood alone beneath the giant, glowing monitors while executives and engineers stared at her like she did not belong there. Then Ethan made a decision that changed everything. Prepare the prototype for another test run, he said calmly. Confused voices immediately filled the room. Mercer looked stunned. At this hour? Ethan never looked away from Clara. And this time, he said quietly, Clara Bennett will lead the recalibration herself. The control room buzzed with tension as engineers rushed around the Velocity prototype preparing for another overnight test. Outside the massive glass walls, snow drifted across the tracks beneath pale floodlights while the silver train sat waiting in absolute silence. Clara stood near the central console, staring at hundreds of flashing data points scrolling across the monitors. Her palms felt cold despite the heat inside the room. She had spent years dreaming about moments like this. But dreams had never included standing in front of executives, government observers, and senior engineers who clearly wanted her to fail. Mercer watched her from across the room with open disbelief. This is insane, he muttered sharply to Ethan. You are handing a national project to a station janitor. Ethan never looked away from the monitor. No, he replied calmly. I am handing it to the only person who actually understands the system. Clara heard every word. Part of her wanted to disappear immediately. Another part remembered her father standing beside old rail engines with grease on his hands saying, trust the math, even when people do not trust you. Clara inhaled slowly and stepped toward the console. I need direct access to the stabilization core, she said quietly. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks. Mercer folded his arms. Absolutely not. Ethan answered before anyone else could. Give it to her. The room fell silent again. One engineer reluctantly transferred the system controls to Clara's station. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a brief second before she began working. The screens shifted rapidly as she rewrote correction sequences line by line. Magnetic compensation curves. Wind resistance timing. Suspension harmonics. Every adjustment flowed almost instinctively now, built from years of midnight calculations hidden inside cheap notebooks and grease-stained blueprints. Engineers who mocked her earlier slowly stopped talking altogether. They simply watched. Increase predictive stabilization by 12%. Clara instructed calmly without looking up. Redirect secondary correction through the rear suspension array. One technician blinked. That will overload the system. Clara shook her head slightly. No. It will balance the pressure transfer before oscillation begins. Ethan studied her quietly from the far side of the room. The nervous janitor from Union Station was gone now. Standing beneath the glow of the monitors was an engineer. Confident. Focused. Brilliant. Clara finally stepped back from the console nearly 40 minutes later. It is ready. Mercer scoffed immediately. You adjusted $1 billion prototype in under an hour. Clara met his eyes calmly for the first time. No. I corrected what should never have been changed. Ethan gave a small nod toward the test crew. Begin the run. Outside, the Velocity prototype slowly glided forward along the illuminated tracks. Inside the control room, giant screens displayed live telemetry data while the speed climbed steadily. 80 miles per hour. 120. 150. Clara's heart pounded violently as the stabilization graphs flickered across the monitors. Everything held steady. One engineer leaned forward in disbelief. Lateral vibration is down 40%. Mercer's expression hardened. The train accelerated further. 170 miles per hour. Then 180. This was where the system always failed before. The room became so quiet Clara could hear the faint hum of electricity inside the monitors. A warning light suddenly blinked yellow. Several engineers stiffened instantly. Crosswind pressure spike approaching. Someone announced nervously. Clara's eyes locked onto the stabilization graph. Wait for it, she whispered softly. Outside, snow whipped violently across the elevated track as the train entered the pressure zone. The prototype trembled once. Then the new correction system activated automatically. Smoothly. Perfectly. The vibration graph stabilized almost instantly. Silence exploded across the control room. One engineer actually removed his glasses and stared at the screen in shock. It corrected itself, he whispered. The train continued accelerating. 190 miles per hour. 195. Then suddenly the giant monitor flashed bright green across the room. 200 miles per hour achieved. New national rail speed record. Nobody moved for a full second. Then the control room erupted into chaos. Engineers shouting. Applause breaking out across the floor. Government officials staring in disbelief. But Clara barely heard any of it. Her eyes had filled with tears before she even realized it. Because for the first time in her life, the world had finally listened. 1 year later, snow drifted softly across the Chicago skyline as thousands of people gathered outside the newly completed Carter Rail terminal beneath glowing television lights and enormous digital billboards. Reporters lined the platforms holding microphones while cameras pointed toward the silver train waiting silently beside the station. But tonight, the train no longer carried the temporary Velocity prototype name. Across the polished steel body in elegant black lettering was a single word. Clara. The crowd erupted into applause as the station speakers announced the official launch of the fastest passenger rail system in American history. Clara Bennett stood near the platform entrance in a navy blue coat, completely overwhelmed by the sight in front of her. A year ago, she had scrubbed these same station floors alone at 2 in the morning while people laughed at her dreams. Tonight, senators, engineers, investors, and journalists had flown in from across the country just to hear her speak. Even now, part of her still felt like the girl carrying wet blueprints through freezing rain. Ethan stepped beside her quietly. He wore a dark wool coat against the winter cold, but his eyes never left Clara. Nervous? He asked softly. Clara laughed under her breath. Terrified. Ethan smiled faintly. Good. That means you care. She glanced toward him. So much had changed over the past year. After the successful test run, Carter Rail Industries launched a full investigation into Daniel Mercer's actions. The stolen engineering files, altered calibration systems, and falsified reports eventually destroyed his career completely. But Clara never cared much about revenge. What mattered to her was something far simpler. She finally had the chance to build the kind of train her father once dreamed about. Safe. Fast. Honest. Ethan gently handed her something small wrapped in dark cloth. Clara frowned slightly before unfolding it carefully. Her breath caught. Instantly. Inside rested the original blueprint that had fallen into the puddle at Union Station months earlier. The paper had been professionally restored and mounted behind protective glass, but one faint water stain still remained near the corner. Ethan watched her expression carefully. "I wanted to preserve it exactly the way it was," he said quietly. Clara traced the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. "You kept this?" Ethan nodded. "It reminded me of the night I met the woman smarter than every engineer in my company." Clara looked down, smiling softly despite the tears forming in her eyes. "You really know how to make someone emotional before a national speech." That was not the emotional part. Clara looked up in confusion. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly. Then he knelt on one knee right there on the crowded station platform beneath the falling snow. The entire crowd gasped audibly around them as reporters instantly swung cameras toward the scene. Clara's eyes widened in complete shock. Ethan looked up at her with the same calm blue eyes that first saw her potential beneath fluorescent station lights months ago. "You once told me nobody listened to girls cleaning train stations," he said softly. "I think the whole country is listening now." Clara's breath trembled. Ethan opened a small velvet box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the station lights, like silver rails stretching into the distance. "You changed this company," he continued quietly. "You changed transportation in this country. And somewhere along the way, you changed me too." Snow drifted across his shoulders as the crowd around them fell completely silent. "Clara Bennett," he said gently, "will you marry me?" Clara covered her mouth with shaking fingers as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. Then she laughed softly through the emotion and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course yes." The crowd exploded.